Good evening. On behalf of the Indiana University College of Arts and Sciences, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Vanessa Clough, and I serve as the college's Director of Alumni Relations. Because we are unable to offer in-person events at this time, we want to provide our alumni and friends a chance to hear from faculty experts through our Food for Thought live streaming series. We hope this opportunity will inspire you to explore new topics or performances, reconnect with a favorite professor, or simply revisit the academic experience. This evening's featured presenter is Michael Hamburger, a professor of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences here in the college at Indiana University. His research on natural hazards includes earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, and landslides. Hamburger has strong interest in the intersection of natural disasters, environmental challenges, and science policy. Following his presentation, he will be joined by newly minted alumna and Wells Scholar, Kendra Obermaier. As we take your questions, Kendra is a recent Indiana University graduate, earning her bachelor's degree in biology and environmental sustainability studies with a liberal arts management program certificate just last month. She is currently pursuing intersectional work through environmental policy and technology, focus on conservation and climate change mitigation. You can submit your questions at any point during this evening's presentation. In fact, why don't you help us get started by letting us know where you're tuning in from? Simply click the questions tab located at the bottom of your screen and share your location. Without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Michael Hamburger.
Hey, everybody. First of all, can you hear me okay? At least somebody who can answer on the mic?
Yes, we can.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, greetings. I'm so pleased to see so many people come out from all corners of the country, from the looks of the answers that you guys submitted. It's amazing the connections that Indiana University and the college have made around the country and around the world. And I'm really grateful to Vanessa and the folks at the Advancement Office for putting this event together. And I'm really pleased that Kendra Obermaier has joined us and will be with us for the second half of the program. So let me start in, oh my gosh, we got somebody from Maui here. Let me start in by sharing the screen, and I hope you can see the PowerPoint now. Does that look reasonable? So I'm guessing that I lured some of you in with this grandiose title, and I think I probably ought to start with a little bit of a sheepish admission. You're not going to hear a presentation by a renowned expert on virus epidemiology or a climatologist who studied global climate change, or even a historian who studies the past and the future of civilization. But you are going to get somebody who has been watching and listening to the reporting of the coronavirus pandemic, has been following climate change as an interested scientist and an advocate for many years, and who's interested in the intersection of these phenomena with something I have studied for most of my career, and that is natural disasters. So maybe a word about that kind of ambitious title. It's actually stolen from a title that I've used for a course I've taught for the last several years, most recently in conjunction with the Wells Scholar Program, and Christoph Irmscher, my colleague and director of the Wells Program, has co-taught this seminar several times, where we try to bring together all of the disciplines in academia, science, social science, history, fine arts, humanities, to try to understand these most fundamental, challenging moments in the history of civilization. And I've been thinking about this a lot the last few years, about the ways that natural disasters change the course of civilization. And somehow over the last weeks and months, as the news coverage of the coronavirus pandemic has unfolded, there's been a lot of headlines and a lot of comparisons with the coronavirus as essentially a natural disaster occurring in slow motion. So I want to consider some of the comparisons between natural disasters, pandemics, and, as we'll see a little later, climate change. So the kind of, to frame this issue, we kind of think about the things that might change the trajectory and the course of civilization. And in this famous and quite controversial book, Jared Diamond has explored the processes, the human and environmental processes that may lead either to collapse or to sustainability of various societies. His book focused very much on the slow acting environmental changes like climate change and the interactions with human decisions that have determined the course of history. I've introduced my students to a kind of alternate view with this warm and fuzzy title, Apocalypse: Earthquakes, Archaeology, and the Wrath of God, written by one of my colleagues, a seismologist from Stanford, Amos Noor, who studies earthquakes in the old world and claims that these sudden shocks associated with natural disasters may mark the terminations of important elements of that civilization. So in either case, whether it's these slow acting stresses or these fast acting shocks, a kind of key word that's now very popular both in social science, in disaster studies, in psychology, is the concept of resilience, the ability to prepare for, plan for, absorb, recover from, or more successfully adapt to actual or potential adverse events. It's a kind of fancy, wordy way of saying, can we bounce back after some sudden impact, in this case, perhaps like a global pandemic? So what I want to kind of break up this talk into a few parts and hopefully elicit some discussion from your side, some questions and comments. And first, just thinking about the connection between these three phenomena: the COVID pandemic, global climate change, and natural disasters. So kind of when we think about, and when I teach about natural disasters, I typically use this kind of working definition: a sudden onset natural phenomenon that produces devastating human impact. So that definition encompasses things like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, tornadoes, tsunamis, things that come on very suddenly, often with minimal or only a minor amount of warning, and produce devastating natural impact. The definition is meant to exclude slow acting phenomena like drought or El Niño's weather effects. And it's meant to exclude human phenomena like nuclear war or terrorism or chemical spills. So we might think first about whether the COVID pandemic fits that definition or not. In the upper left and upper right of your screen, you see a screenshot of an animation showing the growth of the coronavirus pandemic starting in January in the left and through the near recent past as it spread through the whole world, much of the world. So this is a process that has taken place over the course of many months. And the course of the pandemic has taken a very different shape in different countries, with some like China starting very early, others coming on late, others still to emerge. Somehow the United States has defined itself as a leader in the field of COVID fatalities, and that's an interesting question, why some countries are hit much worse than others. In any case, this is very much a human phenomenon, and it takes place over much longer timescales than natural disasters. So it wouldn't fit the exact definition, but I want to give you kind of a spoiler alert of what my conclusion is going to lead to, is that in fact, not so much that the coronavirus is a slow motion natural disaster, but it's a speeded up version of what we might expect with the global challenge of climate change. So as this headline implies, perhaps this gives us an opportunity to think through the kind of global processes that we might undertake to prepare ourselves for the challenge of climate change. So I don't know if this is too much information, but I thought it's worth kind of taking a moment to compare these three phenomena in a kind of formal way. On the left is an image of a hurricane, a microscopic image of the coronavirus, an image of the Earth representing these three phenomena. And just to think about the temporal and spatial scale of these phenomena, typical natural disasters take shape over the course of minutes to hours, sometimes extending into days and longer periods. The COVID pandemic is an order of magnitude longer, taking shape over weeks to months to perhaps years. And the phenomenon of climate change is again an order of magnitude longer time duration, extending over years to decades. The scope of the impacts also vary, the spatial scale. Most natural disasters, even the biggest ones, take place over kind of local to regional scales, hundreds to maybe thousands of kilometers. The COVID pandemic started as a regional phenomenon, but now has extended to a global scale. And climate change, of course, is a global phenomenon that affects different parts of the world in different ways, but extends around the whole globe. The way they take shape is quite different. Natural disasters really hit hard on our physical infrastructure, our homes, our businesses, our building. COVID pandemic is more like a neutron bomb. It's barely affected the built environment, yet it has had devastating impacts on human health. Climate change, in a way, has an impact on all of these, but more importantly and more frighteningly, it affects the entire global life support system, the agriculture, the fisheries, the things that we depend on for survival. The scale of financial and human impact also is a logarithmic scale. Natural disasters might cause hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars in damage, thousands of fatalities, perhaps tens to even hundreds of thousands. The pandemic costs already estimated in trillions of dollars. Fatalities so far measured in hundreds of thousands, but could extend to millions. And climate change, we're talking tens to hundreds of trillions of dollars, and the fatalities are unknown. One statistic may be worth considering is that by mid-century, there's an estimate that there may be as many as 145 million displaced refugees, essentially environmental refugees from climate change. Okay, so let's keep those comparisons in mind. The next little segment here, I want to think about kind of the lessons I've learned from studying and teaching about natural disasters and how they might relate to the COVID pandemic. So this is a kind of diagram that's often used in emergency management circles, and it's sometimes called the disaster cycle or the disaster management cycle. And basically the idea is pretty simple. When a big event occurs, a large earthquake, a tsunami, a volcanic eruption, in the immediate hours and days afterwards, we're preoccupied with the response phase, the search and rescue, the trying to get health care to people who are injured, the finding people in remote areas and getting aid to them. Over the course of weeks following a natural disaster, we move into a restoration and recovery stage where we're starting to rebuild homes and rebuild from economic damage, restructure the economy in a way that people can bounce back afterwards. But the most important and often the most neglected part of the disaster cycle is this mitigation and preparation period. It's the decades or even centuries in between natural disasters where the society has an opportunity to prepare for the next one. So this is the critical time when we can invest in resilience, in mitigation of the impacts of disasters. And it turns out that we save so much money if we invest in mitigation and preparedness that we would have to spend afterwards in response and recovery, perhaps a factor of 10. So certainly a lesson learned about the coronavirus is that we did not invest enough in this preparedness phase, and perhaps now we will do so for the next cycle of pandemics. The second is a concept of environmental justice that is related to natural disasters, or you might even call it disaster justice. When you think about a hurricane approaching the Gulf Coast, you might think of it as an equal opportunity disaster that affects, kind of everybody in harm's way. But as we learned in such graphic ways from Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the impacts were far from uniform, and invariably the poorest and the most vulnerable and the least equipped were those who were most affected, who had the greatest number of fatalities, health effects, and economic damage. So when we talk about natural disasters, there are two key words we use. One is exposure. What is the population that's going to be hit by that natural hazard? And second, what is the vulnerability? What's the degree to which the individuals and the infrastructure that they depend on is going to be impacted by that disaster? And lo and behold, in disaster after disaster, we see that the poorest, the minority communities are the ones who are most exposed and most vulnerable. And to make things worse, when these natural disaster hits, our ability to rebuild and reconstruct is guided by economic tools that most of the poorest communities don't have. So that, for example, in this study of Hurricane Harvey a couple of years ago in Texas, we find that the census tracts that were hit hardest by the hurricane were also those with the lowest level of flood insurance and the least ability to build back afterwards. At a global scale, we see this in devastating ways in the developing world. This is an example from 1991, the so-called super cyclone in the Indian Ocean named Marian, after my mother-in-law, that struck one of the poorest countries in South Asia, Bangladesh, whose residents are located so close to sea level and with so little protection that somewhere between 130 and 150,000 fatalities were recorded. And of those, an estimate of 90% of the fatalities were among women. So within each population, often it is the most vulnerable who are subject to the impacts of these natural disasters. We've seen the same thing play out in the coronavirus in the form of economic, racial, and social disparities in the impact of the coronavirus. So, for example, in numerous places around the country, the plot on the left shows the fatality rate among African Americans and the total population that were impacted in the light blue, and the fatalities in the orange among African Americans compared to the general population in each of 5 southern states. And in each case, the fatality rate was something like double the percentage in the population. Whereas in the plot on the right shows a more complete compilation for countries around the country, for states around the country. And you see it's not just a southern phenomenon. In virtually every state in the country, the impact of coronavirus on African Americans is anywhere from 1/3 to double the rate among the population as a whole. This remarkable compilation from the New York Times this Sunday illustrates kind of what at least part of the cause of that is. And these plots show 6 types of medical conditions that are known to be contributing factors to morbidity and mortality from COVID-19. And it shows the general population, or the percentage in the general population of African Americans in color, and the areas, the dots, each dot representing a census tract around the country, shown in blue, are the ones with the highest concentration of African Americans. And what is shown on the y-axis is the likelihood in the population of, or the prevalence of that condition in the population. So the higher up on the y-axis, the more prevalent it is, the lower down, the less prevalent it is. And we see with all 6 of these kind of pre-existing conditions that African Americans, probably as a result of poor chronic medical care and access to medical insurance and medical resources and others, are the most affected by these complicating conditions. The same thing is true about climate change, but on a global scale. So when we look at the top plot, which shows the historical carbon dioxide emissions per capita per person, we see that it's largely the global north, North America, Europe, Northern Asia, Australia, that have produced the highest carbon dioxide emissions per person. And yet the areas most heavily, most vulnerable to climate change, shown in the lower plot, are those in the global south. South America, Africa, South Asia are the places, that are expected to be most deeply affected. To make matters worse, the actual fatality rate associated with climate change is orders of magnitude higher in the developing world, and particularly in Africa and Southern Asia, than it is in the developed world. When there's the World Health Organization estimates something on the order of 150,000 fatalities annually currently from climate change. This isn't a phenomenon that is going to be taking place sometime in the distant future. It is already here with its impacts. I want to emphasize one thing that's been an area of great interest to me, and that is when natural disasters strike, when a big pandemic strikes, suddenly the government, the society in general, has a deep and abiding interest in what scientists have to say. So in the kind of 36 hours after an earthquake, I often get my moment to speak to the media about what I know about earthquakes. In the case of the pandemic, of course, we have seen more and more interest in epidemiologists, public health officials, pulmonologists, to hear what they know about the coronavirus and how we might respond to it. This was a familiar picture in the newspapers and in the national news about the leading government scientists, Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx, in these daily briefings, where, at least for this moment in time, science was elevated to what I think is perhaps its rightful role. I'm going to take a little detour here and do a little bit of a shameless plug. This is something that's been my passion for the last 3 years in particular, and something I've been interested in for many years before that. In the aftermath of the last presidential election and concerns about signs of the suppression and antagonism towards science in Washington, here at IU, we started an organization, informal, grassroots, nonpartisan, not formally part of the university, called Concerned Scientists at IU. We've hosted a number of big public events, educational events. We've done a bunch of legislative advocacy about elevating the role of science in policy-making decisions. Most recently, a meeting with our congressman to discuss the COVID virus and the importance of public health responses. If any of you out there are interested in learning more about it, there's a link to the website, csiub.org, and an email, and I would be glad to follow up with any of you who are interested. Okay, one of the other things that happens in natural disasters, and appears to be happening in the coronavirus as well, is an emergence or re-emergence of big government operations. It's illustrated here with a photograph from the National Guard magazine, not a journal I regularly read, but with a picture of the Puerto Rico National Guard, who had just finished duty in a cleanup after a major local natural disaster, a series of earthquakes that struck southern Puerto Rico, and now are being asked to respond to a national and global crisis, the coronavirus pandemic, and who knows, perhaps brought in to engage with the political unrest surrounding the racial justice protests in Washington and elsewhere. So not just the military, of course, but big government agencies like the CDC, the National Institutes of Health, FEMA, are the ones who are brought to bear, pushing back a little bit on this tendency to privatize many of these important roles of government. And we see it again in the issues related to climate change, the primary importance of government action in working to affect climate change resilience. So the last part of the talk, I want to spend a few minutes kind of thinking about the impact of this pandemic on the global environment and how this little virus might actually change the trajectory of our society and our world related to climate change. So first, as we discuss with all natural disasters, one of my bywords to students is that it's all about the context. A volcanic eruption happening in some distant island in the Aleutians where nobody's living is going to have minimal impact, yet one at Mount Vesuvius where there are 3 million people living around the flanks in Naples and the surrounding areas will have enormous impact. So when we talk about global environmental issues, we have to look at the context of human impacts on the environment. And these images illustrate the massive ways that humans have changed the face of the world and in our use of fresh water and our use of energy systems, our building of mega cities, changes in land use associated with agriculture. And this is illustrated in this series of plots. I know there's a lot of stuff to look at here, but we'll simplify it with the amazing title, The Great Acceleration, which records on the left side these remarkable trends that have taken place in the human population here in the upper left, and the ways that we are using the natural world. So for example, energy use here, water use here, fertilizer consumption, travel, tourism, telecommunications, and so on. And all of these plots have these exponential growth curves. They've gone from fairly flat through the early part of this century and then suddenly turned upward in a great acceleration. The plots on the right show a kind of frightening corollary, and that is their impact on the natural world. So we have, for example, the growth of carbon dioxide, something we'll come back to, the tons of fish from the world's oceans that are captured each year, the loss of tropical forest, the acidification of the oceans, and so on. And so what all of this implies is a massive change in the shape of the surface of the Earth, and ones that have taken place amazingly within my lifetime. This dotted line at 1950 is often considered the beginning of this great acceleration. That's a few years before the year I was born. And so the world that I turn over to my children and grandchildren is going to look very different from the world that I grew up in. And perhaps the most important and relevant to this discussion is this correlation, the so-called hockey stick curve that shows the correlation between the growth in carbon dioxide in the red curve and the gradual and then more rapid increase in global temperatures over the course of the last century or so, now reaching record levels in both carbon dioxide and temperature. Well, I want to take a little bit of an aside and think about the impact of not so much the coronavirus, but the shutdown that we undertook to flatten the curve. You've all seen photographs like this one, the famous freeways of Los Angeles suddenly empty. Perhaps you've heard recordings of bird sounds in New York City and Paris and elsewhere. The face of our cities has drastically changed. It can be recorded quantitatively. So these plots show for 6 different cities the changes in traffic congestion. So the higher numbers, the tops of the plots are more congestion, lower numbers are less. And you see a comparison between 2019 in blue, 2020 in red. And you can see, you can kind of tell when the lockdown started. So in Shanghai, starting in late January, early February. It dropped to almost nothing. In New York and London, it was considerably later in late March, but tremendous changes there. And it's observable. This is a remarkable photograph from a city I've spent a fair amount of time in Kathmandu in Nepal. This is a site that people do not remember seeing for decades, a clear view of the Himalayas from the edge of the city. It's one of the most polluted cities in Asia, and the lockdown almost immediately cleared up the air. This can be detected by satellite. These are measurements of nitrogen pollution. The bright or the deeper colors show areas with more nitrous oxide pollution for 6 different cities, 2019 on the left, 2020 to the right. So this is going to actually offset the number of deaths from coronavirus. There will be less fatalities associated with pollution this year than there were before. As all of us know, airlines have mostly been sidelined. This again compares 2019 traveling through the first part of the year with 2020. It's amazing. The percentage of air travel now is something like a 20th of what it normally would be. Tremendous impact on the environment. And that's captured in this recent study in the journal Nature that documents over the course of these 4 months this drastic decrease in use of aviation and surface transport that's resulted in, less carbon dioxide put into the atmosphere. However, to put it in kind of a global perspective, some other things have not decreased. So for example, our residential energy use has even gone up a little bit as we're sitting at home in the evenings streaming videos. So this is an overall look at the effect on the global carbon dioxide. And we can see 50 years worth of record of our emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, more than doubling in the last 50 years, but then a precipitous drop over the course of these last few months. We're going to expand that here. So this is 5 months time scale, and we can see it went down slowly at first, and as the lockdown spread around the world, increased to a minimum, and now, unfortunately, is slowly increasing back up. This is an estimate now, again, looking at over a century at this gradual increase, the great acceleration in the global carbon dioxide rate associated with economic growth. This dot shows the estimate for 2020, which is a significant drop, somewhere between 5 and 7% decrease. And you can compare that to other drops like in the 2008 financial collapse, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the big oil shocks in the 1970s. This will be a big change in our input of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. Now, here's the bad news, is that for the past 60 years, we've been doing a remarkable experiment by spewing this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And this father and son team have been dutifully measuring it every day for the last 60 years to follow these ongoing seasonal cycles and the gradual growth in carbon dioxide, which has now reached the highest level it's ever been. And it looks like we will not see any detectable change, or only a minor detectable change in the global levels of carbon dioxide, because this has been accumulating for the last 100 years. And what we add or don't add in the last few months has only a tiny impact on that total. And we can see that also in the estimates of global temperatures for the first part of each year over the last 50 years, 60 years. And we see this gradual increase in temperature, the highest temperature recorded globally in 2016. It looks like we are on target in 2020 to match that or come very close to it to become one of the hottest years on record. And the really challenging news is that, in fact, if we want to bring the global temperatures down to that magic level of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which would limit the global impact of climate change, we have to do what we do this year, but continue doing it every year for the next 15 or 20 years to kind of flatten the curve on climate change, to bring it down to a level where our global fisheries, our coral reefs, our global agriculture system won't be severely impacted by climate change. So now I've got a little trick I want to do, and that's to try something I haven't done before, and that is a polling question. And I think, oh, let's see, I've got to do it here. So I am going to share a poll. And can you guys see the poll? I hope.
Yes.
So it's a question. We're in the middle of one of the worst pandemics in our lifetimes. Is this a perfect opportunity to try to address climate change, or is this a time when we should wait and take care of the urgent economic and social needs while before we start in on this challenge? So I'm going to give you a moment to plug in your answers. And I think I have what is probably not a totally representative part of the American population, but this is a pretty remarkable story. 92% of you suggest that this is a perfect opportunity to address climate change. And nearly 10%, and that's a fair argument, argue that this is the worst possible time. And I'd like to hear from, I would like to hear from them as well. And what I'd like to do is one more poll question, but ask you to put your poll answer in the question window. And that is whether there are some observations that you've made either from reading the newspapers or from your family or discussions with neighbors that have give you some optimism about addressing the challenge of global climate change, and see what comes up in the comment window, and then to kind of lead into the questions and discussion. So I want to conclude with a few thoughts and a couple of wonderful quotes. A concluding thought, actually, let me stop you from reading that quote and just kind of bring back the question of natural disasters. So one of the things that has always struck me about natural disasters is that they represent a kind of singularity in the history of civilization. Anybody who's been through a major natural disaster describes a period before the natural disaster and a period after the natural disaster as being two distinct parts of their personal lives and history. And those singularities are often an opportunity to totally transform the trajectory of civilization. A couple that we've discussed in our classes are the giant eruption of Santorini volcano in Greece in the second millennium BC, which probably destroyed or deeply damaged the thriving Minoan civilization on Greece. But it was that change that led to the rise of the great Hellenic civilization of the next millennium, and to the record of Athenian Greece that is such an important part of Western culture. The earthquake in Lisbon in 1755 came at a critical moment in the Enlightenment, and a critical time in a battle for political control of the kind of reins of government and the growth of secular society, and in a way is related to the goals of the American Revolution and the American Constitution. And maybe more recently in my lifetime, the occurrence of a giant earthquake in Armenia was kind of the last straw that somehow led to the breakdown of the Soviet Union. So a question for us is, can we take this moment when we've taken a big pause from our lives and use it in a way to address the most challenging long-term issues that face our civilization? And I, for one, am optimistic about it. I think there are big changes that are happening every day, and perhaps we can find a way to flatten the curve. So now I'm going to leave you with these two quotes. Christiana Figueres, some of you may know this name or this face, led the COP21 meeting in Paris in 2015. And she wrote just in the last week or so, crises are a moment of rupture and change. In the midst of the pandemic, we face a choice between recovering the carbon-intensive global economy that has set us on a path towards environmental breakdown, or accelerating the transition towards a future that prioritizes the health of people and planet. Today, that future may be closer within our reach than it was at the beginning of 2020. And last, one of my other heroes, Greta Thunberg, wonderful quote, "Since our leaders are behaving like children, we will have to take the responsibility they should have taken long ago." This is the time for the intergenerational transfer of power. And so I will leave with Greta's words and turn it over to the next generation and share the mic with Kendra.
Thank you so much for that presentation, Professor Hamburger. I think it's always fascinating to think about what our current situation can tell us that we should be learning and how we can apply something that seems human, but also incredibly overwhelming to changing something that is important for the entire planet. So thank you very much for that. We have a fascinating discussion going on in the Q&A and a lot of really thoughtful comments about what about this is encouraging. One that I think is a theme that's coming up is hope around the significant decrease in carbon emissions that have occurred during this time. And I think, for example, Brenna Tate said that this is a great time to address climate change because so many people are aware of the real impact of decreasing our energy consumption. Again, these graphs are consumable. It's amazing to realize how much we can do when we change actions like, being at home. But I think an important part of that is that the information needs to be consumable, and we need to see that we can actually do something. And if information is not consumable, then it's harder to get people to act. Like if they don't know that their actions are going to have an impact, it's harder to get them to act. So how do you see us being able to incite people to act and communicate what we are learning about climate change to the public at large, which relates, I think, to your science advocacy work you talked about earlier?
So, of course, it's a wonderful question, and it's so fundamental to any kind of social change. One of the things that's been really remarkable while watching the COVID pandemic and its response unfold is that there's been this combination of individual action and collective action. And that's, of course, at the heart of so many political and social change questions. So there's a recognition that both action from government and individual responsibility is part of it. And I think this line of flattening the curve is such a powerful concept, that there are things that we can do in our everyday lives that really will have a national and global impact on something that could affect us and our loved ones. I think there's something also remarkable about those pictures of the clear skies in Los Angeles and Kathmandu and New Delhi. People are valuing things that they've lost. They didn't maybe realize how much that they had given up with industrialization. And I think there may be a change in values. Certainly it's true among individuals who I talk to, is that reassessing how they spend their time and what their priorities are is something that's happening around the country and around the world. So it gives me some optimism that we can take on an issue as big as climate change and find a way to address those issues. Coming back to your original question about communication, that is critical. And as the wonderful climatologist, Catherine Hayhoe, often starts her presentations, the most important thing that you can do about climate change is, she waits for a long pause, is to talk about it. So talking about it with your friends and family and community members is the first step in making those social changes happen.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Another interesting thread in the comments is about the revolutionary nature of what's required to do climate change. And I think there's one of the first question actually came from Joe Lighthizer, who said, without a fundamental change in human nature, at least as suggested by known history, do you see any reason for hope? And I think one response to that came from a Lara Hamburger, I wonder if there's a relation, but that said, if we can divest from the police, can't we also divest from fossil fuels? And I'm interested in your perception, especially talking about how natural disasters can change communities, what you think would be necessary to revolutionize our population beyond just talking like about climate change, but do you think we will need singularity events to revolutionize the population, or what else may need to happen?
Yeah, that's a very good question for a sociologist and a historian to answer better than I. I will say there are lots of things that give me hope. There are things that change and sometimes change very quickly, and things that we thought could never change. These protests that are sweeping the nation are a reminder that things can change in an instant over the course of a few days. As one climate colleague, Ben Brabson, wisely said, there was a time when we thought that slavery was something that our country could never get rid of. And through a series of social changes, and complicated ones that haven't been completed yet, we went from a society in which was founded on slavery to one in which it wasn't. So it is a complicated thing that involves a vast array of kind of pervasive social and personal changes, as well as leadership from the top. From my perspective, this is an unfortunate moment where that leadership in many of those spheres is not happening in a way, at least that I would like to see. But big events like earthquakes and hurricanes or pandemics are a time for us to say, what do we want our society to look like from here on? And I think it's a moment, and I hope we will grab it. It's an interesting thing that this is occurring in an election year, because I think all of these issues are going to be up for grabs this year, and it will be interesting to see how they play out.
That is fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. On that note, this is actually a question that comes more from me than the Q&A, so I apologize to everybody. Feel free to put more questions in there, but I'm interested in your perception on the need for scientists to be apolitical. And you talked earlier about science advocacy, and I noticed that you were intentional in saying that the concerned scientists at IU are a partisan organization.
Nonpartisan.
And I'm curious, or sorry, nonpartisan. Yes, that's what I meant. Sorry, nonpartisan organization. Yeah, blows the point of my whole question if I phrase it this way, but nonpartisan organization. And I'm curious if you believe that scientists should, by nature, including yourself, a geologist, be nonpartisan in their work, or if there's a way for scientists to be partisan, or to make their work impactful without having to seem completely rational all the time or completely objective.
Yeah. That's a really fundamental question. I do each fall a professional development course for our new graduate students, where we explore what the professional life of a scientist might look like for their generation. And we spend a day talking about one of my favorite topics, which is the scientist in public life. And of course, there's a whole range of views on that. There are people who feel like scientists should stay completely out of the public sphere. They should do their objective research, present their results. If policymakers want to use them, let them carry them forth and move them into policy. But we dilute our power if we become politicized. And science certainly has become politicized, whether we want it to be or not. My own feeling is that we are in a place where we no longer can afford to be in an ivory tower or a laboratory isolated from the reality of the world. If you're working in a virology lab focusing on creating a vaccine for coronavirus, or you're studying earthquakes, or even learning about cosmology and the history of the universe, I think we have to think about the applications of our knowledge to the world we live in and do it in a way that benefits all people. There's a real soul searching going on in the last week in the scientific society about what our role as scientists and academics has been in either promulgating or looking aside as systemic racism and inequality permeates our world. And so that's also part of the context of the world that we work in. And what I do think is important is for us to be clear what hat we're wearing when we're doing what. So when I met with Congressman Hollingsworth, I made it clear that I was not speaking as a virologist or an expert on public health. I was speaking as an advocate when I present results on earthquake hazards in the Midwest. I try to wear my seismologist hat on.
Yeah, it's a fantastic answer. And I think it also maybe leads to a secondary question that scientists need to ask themselves, which is, when is the duty to inform the policymaker who will then act, and when do scientists have a duty to inform the rest of the public and allow the rest of the public to make a decision? Christopher Carlson would also like to add that as an applied scientist working in policy, it is critical that folks who are scientifically literate engage in the public sector and in policy and policies to help inform decisions. Thank you, Chris. I personally agree, but this is my opinion, is not the point of this conversation. We have a fascinating question from the Chloe family, which is, we tend to think about natural disasters as well as the COVID crisis in terms of what it does to humans. But over the last half year, we have seen an incredible loss of non-human life. I would like to add to that, over the last 50 years, we've seen an incredible loss of non-human life. Over 1 billion animals in the Australian bushfires alone, which seem to have almost vanished from our collective consciousness. Is it time to rethink our perspective on survival and shift the focus from human survival?
Whoa, okay, that is a really thought-provoking philosophical question and maybe religious question. Our radar screen typically is aimed at human society, but of course there is a growing recognition, apart from everything else, that human society cannot exist in isolation from the natural world on which of which we are a subset, an annoying large vocal subset, and on which we depend for our very survival. So, even if we wanted to say do what just we need to do to preserve humans, we're making a big mistake if we don't focus on the loss of biodiversity and wild land and so on. And of course, I didn't mention this, but there's a very complicated story about the origins of the coronavirus, the so-called process of zoonosis that relates possibly to habitat loss, to wildfires, to increasing human use of the natural world that brings humans in closer proximity to animals with some of these animal-borne diseases. So again, our decisions about land use and about stewardship of the earth are intimately connected to our own survival. To the philosophical question, that's a really good one. I guess I would like to think that we will be most effective if we form our arguments from a human perspective, but acknowledge the enormous value that the natural world gives all of our lives, and that we couldn't go on without it.
think that's beautiful. Perhaps COVID will give us more time to appreciate the natural world.
Yes, it has.
Yeah, for some of us, for sure. And then there's an additional question from the Chloe family, just as thoughtful. They're coming in strong tonight. Usually people need to either feel or anticipate pain to react. This, I think, relates a little to our question earlier. When do you anticipate the pain of climate change will cause society to react in a serious manner?
Well, first of all, I want to underscore again this basic conclusion that climate change is not something in the future. I actually just came across this World Health Organization estimate of global fatalities, 150,000 fatalities a year that are specifically attributed to climate change now. One of the challenges of climate change is that it comes on relatively slowly, that it affects different places in different ways. We are very aware of it when a sudden burst, a heat wave or a flood event happens. I think the discussion comes to the fore when we have big climate-related natural disasters. So I think perhaps this hurricane season will have this discussion again a few times. And what is really happening in our society is that more and more of our population is aware and concerned about it. Our leaders just haven't kept pace.
Yeah. I think that relates to another theme that I saw earlier in the questions, which was about the impact of seeing solidarity with COVID-19 and how we have the ways in which we have, as a global society, been able to come together. And I think that you are wise to point out the ways in which we also haven't, or the ways in which we have lacked leadership and coordination, and have sometimes put the values of our own nations or communities above those of others. But I think that the need for solidarity and the recognition that we have overall been able to, like, as a society, behave with the most vulnerable in mind, is important to thinking about climate change. And how do you think we can create this sense of global solidarity, especially because many of the communities affected first by climate change are and will be communities abroad. This is already happening. There are communities affected in the United States, but those that are most affected are our island communities and not those we see. So how do you think that we can bring the impact of climate change that's currently happening and will continue to happen away from us closer to home?
Yeah, that's another good question. And of course, sometimes it's a single photograph that does that. You remember the story of the body that was washed up on the Mediterranean of one of the immigrant, perished from one of the immigrant boats, that created such a passionate response in Europe. One thing that I've been very interested in over the last few years is the possible engagement with religious communities on these issues. It's not something that's part of my personal life, but it has been part of my work life over the last few years. And one of the most exciting things that our Concerned Scientists group did this past fall was a series of workshops with 5 evangelical Christian churches in the Bloomington area to discuss the issues of environmental stewardship and climate change in a community that has not always been part of these discussions and has not always been open to the communication with scientists, and scientists have not always been open to that communication either. And one thing that was very interesting is that this phrase, "for the least of these," resonates so strongly with that community, that their kind of moral and ethical compass directs them towards helping the poorest and the most vulnerable in this country and in the world. And of course, it's related to many global manifestations of religious communities. that's not to say that's the only way to do it, but it is certainly a way that can engage people within our country and create a kind of global focus and a global network of response. I neglected to mention one of the most important lessons of natural disasters, and particularly these globally scaled disasters, is the importance of global collaboration. To me, the administration's decision to remove the United States from participation in the World Health Organization in the midst of a global pandemic is really inexcusable. And I know I'm getting a little political here, but apart from what party made what decision, and from the perspective of the scientist addressing global issues, global scientific collaboration is entirely critical. And that's something that we are going to need in force to address the climate change crisis.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to jump on and acknowledge that it's 8 p.m. Our panelists have graciously agreed to continue to answer your inquiries for a little while longer, but we're unable to accept additional questions at this time. For those of you who are unable to join us for overtime, thank you again for participating this evening's live streaming event. We plan to continue to record this session, so I hope that you can tune in at another point in time. With that, I will turn it back over to Kendra. Kendra, you're muted.
Thank you so much. We gotta love Zoom. So we have a couple other, like about 3 more interesting questions that have come up. And the first, which is really practical, is from an anonymous attendee who said that a major frustration and one that they are not easily able to deal with are the deniers. And what is a good resource that is understandable and palatable for people without science backgrounds, that is not going to be touted as the liberal biased fake news organizations? And I think that this plays into another question from Jim Coughlin, who said that we've never before had so much scientific input into addressing various natural disasters, but it's discouraging how politicized something as seemingly benign as mask wearing has become. Can we do a better job of dissemination of information without provoking political backlash?
Oh boy, yeah, that's a really distressing sign. And I don't completely know how to address this partisan divide that's happened on almost every issue. And until very recently, science was largely a bipartisan affair. The House and the Senate usually overwhelmingly supported, science funding. I think it was George W. Bush who proposed a doubling of the budget of the National Science Foundation. There has been often great respect paid to scientists, visiting Capitol Hill. But this has changed radically in the last, gradually over the last decades, but radically in the last few years, where scientists have been sidelined, suppressed, and not allowed to present even the most objective of results. So I find that very disturbing. There's a bipartisan bill called the Scientific Integrity Act that our group has worked hard to support, that protects scientists working in federal agencies. And I think that's just a critical thing to help science proceed in a way that benefits the society more generally. The answer to the first question is, of course, there are lots of resources out there. It depends on the denier, how much they're interested in having a discussion and with whom. Some of my go-to sources are, I could provide the link offline. There's a really nice report that was produced, I think, jointly by the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the National Academy of Sciences, called Climate Change, What We Know, or something like that. It's about a 10-page really concise summary of the state of the knowledge from the premier scientific agencies in the country. There's another similar report produced by the Royal Society of London, maybe together with the National Academy. I'll have to dig up the names. There is a really wonderful group working, I hate to say this, out of Purdue University, the Indiana Climate Change Assessment Program. It was actually commissioned by Senator Lugar to address questions of climate change and its impacts on Indiana. And they have done a superb, objective, nonpartisan way of presenting data specific to our state of Indiana that is done in a way that farmers and businesses and community planners can make use of the data for planning. And I should do a plug for our own Environmental Resilience Institute, part of the Grand Challenge at IU, that is providing direct resources to cities and communities around the state to try to build resilience into their planning for the next decades.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I hope that there's a good way for those to be distributed, and distributed in a way that encompasses multiple views and is accessible to many people, especially because, you know, even people who deny climate change don't necessarily deserve to die from it or to be impacted by it. So I think we could leave with perhaps one more question, which stems from a couple of comments from Christopher Carlson, and about how climate change is currently happening. So he talked about how we are seeing spring melt in the mountains weeks earlier than just decades ago. This has huge implications on our food production and our access to drinking water in the summer and fall across the West. And then also there are comments about how climate change is very real now in Alaska, and about how climate change is not, like you said earlier, in the future. I know in Indiana, our summers are longer. I know that our rain is heavier, our precipitation patterns less regular, and so climate change is already impacting a lot of people in the United States, especially people whose work really relates to the land, and people who work outdoors. Why do you think that people don't necessarily correlate changes that they have experienced in their lifetimes with climate change? And do you think that that there is a way to talk about it that brings up these experiences?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. I think, you know, humans are very good at responding to short-term crises, at dodging a rock that's about to fall on their head or something like that. We're pretty good at anticipating things that might happen in the near future. We see a thundercloud forming, we know to get inside. And we as a society have gotten fairly good at, you know, dealing with things that are weeks and months away. We as a species, as a society, are not so good at dealing with things that are decades away. And I was very much struck by a presentation, a lecture given at our big scientific meeting, the Carl Sagan Memorial Lecture, about the kind of future of the planet, where the comment was made that humans are at this moment in the history of the world where we now undeniably have global impact on the ecosystem and the systems on which life depends. We know about it and we know something about what its implications are, but we have not yet developed any kind of global management system to try to deal with these challenges. And I'll give another tip of the hat to Elinor Ostrom, our wonderful late Nobel laureate, who really worked on these collective systems, that shared systems that we all depend on, and ideally find a way to make use of this global resource for the benefit of all humanity. That's a pretty dream. Now we got to get down in the trenches and make it happen.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, and everybody who participated. We have one comment that I am going to include. Somebody, Benetate, wants to know if you would hold up your dog. Yeah, he might be in the office.
He's
Michael.
right here. Come here. Here he is. Oh, yes. Okay, Tuck, say goodbye to everybody.
This is the most important part of the presentation. I hope that we're all taking notes.
Absolutely.
All right, thank you all so much for coming and for your questions. I very much have enjoyed this, and I hope that you have as well. Thank you, Professor Hamburger, for your insights and wisdom and interest in these intersectional topics.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I don't know about you, but I thought this was fascinating. We'd like to thank you again for joining us. I would also like to thank Professor Hamburger for sharing his expertise, and Ms. Obermaier for moderating tonight's Q&A session. We are grateful to you both. I hope that you can join us for our next Food for Thought live streaming event, which will take place later this month. Finally, events like this would not be possible without the support of donors who understand the value of a liberal arts education. If you would like to support the faculty, students, and programs of the College of Arts and Sciences, please consider making a contribution to the Arts and Sciences Priority Fund. Until then, please take care and stay safe.